Hi, my name is Ken Smith, and you found this video one of two ways. Either you're a fishing fan and you found it linked to one of my fishing videos, which is my pastime, or you found it because of my full-time job, which is working in the financial services industry. This is a talk that I've given, or a version of the talk that I've given many times, most of the time in public to groups, but also I have a similar conversation with clients and prospects that I work with in my full-time job. So if you were just searching on YouTube, you might have been searching for best ways to save for retirement, how do taxes impact my retirement, Roth versus Roth versus traditional IRA, Roth versus 401k, traditional 401k. Any of those things might have brought you to this video, and those are all topics we're going to cover today. So this is going to be a two-part video. First part of the video is going to talk a little bit about kind of where we are as a country from a taxation standpoint. And second part of the video is going to be sort of analyzing all of our different options for long-term savings and what seems to make sense the most. And probably not going to surprise you on a couple of them, probably really going to surprise you on a couple of others. One of the things we're going to talk about is the difference between a traditional 401k and a Roth 401k. And so just so you know, by the way, I've been in the financial services industry since 1987. This is June of 2020. We're kind of in the middle of the COVID pandemic issues we're having around the country right now. I'm working from my home, haven't been to the office really much since March. So let's just kind of dive in and take a look at where we are today. So let's start with this slide. So this just paints a picture of kind of where we are historically from a tax standpoint. So from the left of this chart, you see maximum individual tax rates were not terribly high in the late 1920s, but a number of things changed. Most specifically, what changed was World War II. We ran up a great deal of debt. So this chart shows you the highest marginal U.S. income tax rate for an individual versus debt as a percent of GDP. Now, let's do a quick definition. So GDP simply means the gross domestic product. So it is the value of all finished goods produced in a country. It's generally considered the health of a country. You want it to be growing and not shrinking. And to some degree, it has to do with how much taxation a country can put upon its citizens, because the bigger your GDP, the more taxes you can collect. And what you see here is, and by the way, so a definition of GDP or an explanation would be, for example, the tires made that get shipped every year to Ford to go on new cars. The value of those tires are not part of GDP, but the value of the car once it's completed would be part of GDP. The engine would not be, but the value of the completed car would be. So it's completed goods produced by a country each year. And by the way, as I said earlier, you want it to be growing and not shrinking, which we're probably shrinking right now. We'll get into that. So what you see here is immediately after World War II, we had been producing airplanes and paying troops around the world and making tanks and shipping people all over the world to fight in World War II. We had a very, very high level of debt compared to our gross domestic product. And in fact, eclipsed 100%. So our debt was greater than our gross domestic product in a couple of given years right there. And then what you see here is we had significant increases in tax rates to help pay that debt off. And you see that blue line. So the blue line is highest marginal income tax rate. The red line is debt as a percent of gross domestic product. And you see as those tax rates stayed high, we eventually started paying that down. And then you go all the way into the 80s, and you have in 1981 the Economic Recovery Tax Relief Act of 1981. And then in 86, you have the Tax Relief Act of 86. And those are generally known as the Reagan tax cuts. And you see the Reagan tax cuts began pushing rates down. And in the late 80s, they pushed the rates all the way down, close to where they are today. Today, the maximum individual tax rate would be 37%. So Bill Gates, most of Bill Gates' ordinary income is taxed at 37% in any given year. If you've never heard, by the way, the stories Reagan told about taxes and his thinking on taxes. So, and I'm going to get these numbers wrong. It's been a long time since I've read this, but as I recall, he said he was making about $70,000 per movie in his heyday, and he made 2 movies a year. And he said, so I can make about $140,000 a year, but if I made a third movie because of the state, and by the way, this is just federal, what we've got on the screen, but because of his federal and his state income taxes, he was in an effective 93% tax bracket. He said, so every dollar I made in that next movie, I took home about 7 cents. He said, it just didn't make sense. I just stayed around the ranch and goofed off, and January of the next year, I'd go make a couple more movies. So Reagan had very specific beliefs, or had been impacted by taxes, and therefore wanted lower tax rates, and he was able to do that. So let's flash forward to today, and what you see is a very big disparity between where we are. We're back above 100%, or we will be this year, back above 100% of debt to gross domestic product, and we have what really are pretty much historically low tax rates at 37% max tax rate. And if you take a look at, so the US government last year collected about $3.46 trillion in revenue. Now, where did they get that revenue from? Well, they got that revenue from basically two major sources. They got it from a lot of sources, right? They got it from individual income taxes. They got it from payroll taxes. They have some earnings on treasuries that they hold, excise taxes, other taxes, kind of miscellaneous taxes, and a tiny bit, if I remember the numbers right, like 7% from corporate income taxes. So the vast majority, over 85% of all the government's revenue last year came from me and you. It came from what we paid in individual income taxes and what our employers paid in, or if you're self-employed, what you paid in as payroll tax. So the reason that's important is it's a big factor in some of the calculations of what the deficit's going to be going forward. So I'll come back to that in just a second. So where are we now and where are we headed? Well, the U.S. government for 2019 collected about $3.46 trillion, as we just reviewed, but they spent about $4.4 trillion. In 2020, the Trump tax cuts added about $1.9 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. And by the way, this is I don't care who's in office, Republicans, Democrats, Trump, Biden, somebody else. This is a problem that somebody's got to fix. Somebody's got to be the adult in the room at some point and talk about this. So the tax cuts that Trump put in place, they did exactly what they were designed to do. They stimulated the economy. The market was on a spectacular roll until March of this year when the COVID issues showed up. And now we're going to spend an additional $2 trillion, and possibly more to come from what we're hearing out of Congress, for the COVID Relief Act. So, by the way, that act was and this is so hard for me to say, the CARE Act was the Coronavirus Aid Relief Economic Security Act, was where that $2 trillion got spent. So, looking again forward where we're going to go in the future, the Committee for Responsible Government, which is basically a think tank, estimates that in 2020, without any further COVID relief, we're going to have somewhere around a $3.8 trillion deficit. Now, deficit is for the year, debt's for the full period. So we're going to have a $3.8 trillion deficit just this year. That will be a record. The prior record was back, I believe in 2009, it was $1.4 trillion. They further project, again with no additional spending on COVID relief, that 2021 we're going to have about $2.1 trillion in deficit next year as well. But, big but, I think there's some fuzzy math going on here. Fuzzy math's my term, but I think there's some fuzzy math going on. And by the way, a lot of this conversation today is going to be about math. These ideas make sense for some and don't make sense for others. There is no one size fits all. But if you look at how the government so part of the calculation on all of that, remember, is where income comes into the government. It comes from payroll and individual income taxes. So we got to look pretty hard at unemployment. So you would think the government would calculate unemployment by saying on June 1st of this year we had 15 million people filing for unemployment, and on July 1st we had 20 million people filing for unemployment. We have so many people in the workforce, you do simple math, and that's what your unemployment numbers are. Well, that makes way too much sense for the U.S. government. So that's not at all how the U.S. government does this. In fact, what they do is monthly, the Census Bureau does a survey of 60,000 households. They rotate through a list. That, by the way, is a very small sampling. There are 125.5 million households in the United States, so they're interviewing less than 0.1% of them on a monthly basis. And they basically ask those people a series of questions, and it's a decision tree, if this, then that. So if they ask this and you say no, there's one set of questions. If you say yes, there's another set of questions. And basically they're trying to find out, do you have a job? Have you recently had a job? And are you looking for a job? Basically, if you have not been employed for the last 30 days and you have not interviewed or been looking for a job, you're not even counted in the unemployment numbers. You're considered a discouraged employee and not counted for unemployment. So again, back to that fuzzy math. The Bureau of Labor Statistics recently said, and by the way, I hope a lot of this is much better by the time you see this video. I'm posting it late June, early July of 2020, so I hope this is way better. But the problems that have been developed here, the problems that have been created, are not going away anytime soon. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics just said that unemployment had blown all the way up to about 14.7%. So let's check their math. At the end of 2019, they stated that there were about 131 million U.S. citizens with full or part-time job. By the way, and I know my slide says full-time, but I actually confirmed that is full or part-time. And then they've also reported that since late March, 38.6 million people, so basically April, May, and June, about 38.6 million people filed for newly filed for unemployment claims. So if we were at 3.7% unemployment at the end of the year on 131 million people, that's about 5 million people. If you do the simple math, you're now over 40 million people unemployed of 131 million people that actually count to be in the labor force. That really suggests to us that unemployment's blown through 30%. So why, and oh, by the way, and there's another 16 million Americans who are self-employed, who to a large degree, some can, but many of them can't even file for unemployment. Not to mention those of us like myself, who I'm still fully employed, but my income's down significantly. So there's a whole lot of problems in the math here when you consider that 85.5% of the U.S. government's revenue comes from individuals, from income taxes and from payroll taxes. When you consider that, it sure appears to us that over 30% of all of us are unemployed. Before I jump ahead, so why don't politicians tell us the truth on this? Well, politicians don't tell us the truth on this, kind of like the same reason nobody talks to us about the broken Social Security system. The quickest way not to get reelected is to tell people either you're going to cut their benefits, you're going to cut Social Security, you're going to cut Medicare, you're going to cut Medicaid, or I'm going to increase your taxes. So literally what politicians have done is they have just kicked the can. They try not to pay attention to this. They think, I'll worry about it on the next news cycle. I'll worry about it next time I get reelected. And the problems just keep compounding. So these problems are not going away. Again, it doesn't matter if you are a Republican or a Democrat, or if we have Republican or Democratic Congress or senators or president. These are problems that have been created by years and years of spending and low taxes that are going to have to get fixed. So we are spending like we never have before, right? We just talked about that. We're going to spend something around, without further COVID relief this year, $7.25 trillion. $7.25 trillion we will spend this year. The U.S. government will spend. We collected $3.46 trillion last year, but that was with less than 4% unemployment. So you got to think. By the way, GDP is also shrinking, right? So people aren't working, people aren't consuming. You got some pretty significant issues. There's a Forbes article, I believe written by a guy named Ritz, if I remember right, posted on May 27th. And they estimate that the deficit without further COVID relief is going to be between $4 and $5 trillion this year, roughly equating to 20% of our gross domestic product. This is a significant issue that has got to get resolved. So I think the likelihood is you're going to see exactly what you see right there. Taxes are going up. It's just a question of when. So the second part of this conversation is going to talk about, I think we can all agree that at some point taxes are going up. I also think most of us would agree that they're going to go up in our working lifetimes, in mine and your working lifetimes. I'm 57, about to be 58 years old. I will work till I'm in my mid-60s for sure, probably a little bit longer since I have a small child. Taxes are going to go up in my working lifetime, and they're certainly going to go up probably even more in my retirement years. So this is the time to be thinking about taxes, not when you reach retirement when you can't fix it. By the way, so I am not a fan of annuities. I'm not a fan of annuities because money tied up in annuities, and yes, there are fact trails where annuities make sense. There's just not many of them, in my opinion. Any money being paid out of an annuity is taxed as ordinary income, the worst possible tax treatment for any investment vehicle you can get. So if I'm going to have $1 million in retirement tied up in an annuity, I know I'm going to pay at minimum probably 20% based upon what my actual income is in retirement, and at maximum right now 37%, and probably even higher in retirement. So that $1 million is really only worth $700,000-800,000 at most in spendable dollars. Now is the time to be paying attention to this. Now is the time to look at your investment options. It's why some of your advisors are talking to you about Roth conversions right now. Now's the time to take advantage of, or to think about, not take advantage of. Now's the time to be thinking about where you need to be investing your long-term dollars. So part 2 of this video, if you're watching this on YouTube and on a device that allows it, just popped up in the top of your screen. That little I is part 2 of this video. If that little I didn't pop up, you can go down below in the description. There'll be a link to part 2 of this video where we'll analyze options available to us for savings long-term for retirement and other needs, and kind of which ones make the most sense for most people. So hope you stay tuned, hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you in the next video right now.